Hi, AP Psychology students. Welcome back. Today we are going to be continuing talking about the topic of memory, and we are going to focus on the process of storage. So if you remember last time we talked about encoding, today we're going to talk about storage, and then retrieval will be in a future video. So what are some of the essential questions that we are going to try to answer today? First is, how much information can our memory actually store, and for how long? And then we're going to move into talking a little bit more about the physicality of memory, so memory and the brain. And this is going to focus on how does our brain physically store memories, where does it store our memories in our brain, and we're also going to talk a little bit about the impact of physical stress on our memory. So let's get started. All right, so first we're going to talk about sensory memory. So sensory memory has a storage capacity that is extremely large. So I think one time I read that your eyes can take in the equivalent of like 18,000 songs on an iPod or something. An iPod before iPhones or the iPod, whatever, and an MP3 player. Okay, so 18,000 songs is like the equivalent of information that your eyes can take in, like how many gigabytes that is. It's like intense, right? However, the thing with your sensory memory is that the length is incredibly short. All right, so information comes in through your ears, your eyes, your nose, your smell, your touch, right? And all this stuff is coming in, and then it's very briefly being forgotten unless you pay attention, right? So the two lengths that you need to know in terms of how long it lasts is your iconic memory, which is visual memory, your eyes, right? And it's less than half a second our eyes can hold on to like a picture, right? So for less than half a second, our eyes can hold on to it, and then we start forgetting pieces of it. And that's shown here by this graphic you have right here. So there was a study where they made people, like they showed them this chart of letters, and like for brief, a second they showed it, and then they took it away from the screen, and they gave them like an indication, like a little arrow, either this line, or this line, and they had to recall the items. And if it was done in less than half a second, they were able to recall the letters accurately, but after half a second, they weren't able to recall the information, right? So the next part of sensory memory, or the next type of sensory memory that I want you to know, is echoic or auditory. So this sensory memory is the idea that our ears hold on to information for about 3 to 4 seconds. So this might explain why you've ever been somewhere and somebody says something and you say, what? And then you're like, oh, never mind. And it like kind of clicks in, right? So you hold on to your auditory memories for slightly longer than your visual memory. Next, we're going to talk about short-term memory. So when we talk about short-term memory, we are looking at a capacity of about 7 plus or minus 2 items. So this is what we call the magic number in psychology. And the idea here is that your short-term memory can hold between 7 minus 2, to 9 items at once. And once you get beyond that 9 items, it's very difficult for your short-term memory to hold on to it and to use it unless you're using some sort of strategy like we talked about in the encoding video in order to make it more meaningful, right? The length of your short-term memory is less than 30 seconds. So if you tell me something and I like kind of repeat it or whatever, if I don't do something to cement it into storage, it's only going to last about 30 seconds. Your working memory is a little different. There's not like very specific numbers or seconds that it can do it because it holds on to things, because it's more an active process, right? Remember, working memory is constantly pulling from sensory and long-term to be able to do our active thinking. What we do know about the capacity of working memory is that it is larger for young adults rather than children or older adults. So young adults, let's say from the ages of 16 through 30s, right, probably have a larger working capacity. They can take more information in, they can use more pieces, figure out problem solving easier, better, faster than children or people who are in their 50s and older. We also know that there are some things that you can do to increase your working memory. There are some different ways you can practice to help hold more information into your working memory. We also talked about some different techniques that you can use, like putting things physically, writing them down, all that kind of stuff to help increase your working memory. All right, so long-term memory. So long-term memory is really our memory's final destination, right? And the thing about long-term memory is that the capacity of it is unlimited. So there is no such thing as having a full memory. The length depends. What does it depend on? Well, it depends on the retrieval strategy or the conditions when you learned it or how long it's been there or all kinds of different things, right, that we'll talk about in the retrieval video. However, when you store long-term memory, so when it finally makes it to long-term memory, your brain is now going to store that memory in two different ways. So it's either going to store it as a memory of what something is, and those memories are called explicit. So if you're trying to remember something like, for example, a bike, what is a bike? What is a car? Like vehicles. Those are memories of what things are. Now, when you are storing an explicit memory, there's actually two types of explicit memories. There's episodic memories. So these are memories of personal experiences. So let's say that you are at the homecoming football game and your brain is taking things in, you're remembering things, you're using it, it makes it to long-term memory. Your long-term memory is going to store that memory of what happened at that football homecoming game and your episodic memories in your long-term memory. But let's say you met someone at that game, or let's say you learned some facts about football or the score of the game or those kinds of things, or knowing different pieces of information about people around you. Those are going to be stored in what we call your semantic memory, which is your memory of like facts or information. Now, as you will notice, semantic memories contains part of a word that we already learned, which is semantic encoding. So semantic memories are memories of facts. Semantic encoding is a process you do to help memories make it to long-term explicit memory storage. Then you have implicit memories. So like I said, remember there's two ways. There's memories of what something is. What is the memory experience? What is the fact? Now there's memories of how we do things. Right? Let's go back to the bike example. Memories of what vehicles are, what bikes are, what cars are, what a truck versus a van, etc. Those would all be stored in our episodic memory. However, our memories of how to work those things, like how to ride a bike, how to drive a car, if we knew how to drive a school bus, like any of those things, those would be our implicit memories, our memories of how to do things, right? And we don't often think about those as memories, but they are. Remembering how to play the piano, remembering how to play a sport, remembering how to write. Those are all memories your brain has stored over time, right? These are called procedural memories. So procedural memories are the specific how memories of skills and procedures in your life. The step-by-step things that you've learned over time. And they become implicit in that you do them kind of automatically, right? So we talked about automatic versus effortful encoding. A lot of implicit memories end up being that automatic encoding because you kind of do them without having to think about it. All right, so let's talk about memory and the brain. So with memory and the brain, we need to talk a little bit about some science that we haven't gone through yet. So this is a very basic, and then once we talk about the brain, we'll come back to this in more detail. The first thing I need you to know is that in your brain there are neurons, right? And that those neurons fire when they're trying to speak to one another. So with memory, what we know is that when one neuron is speaking to another, when you're trying to remember something, your brain actually does this thing called long-term potentiation, where the potential for like one neuron to talk to another gets better as you're learning something. So one neuron may speak to another, but then if they keep talking over and over again because you're learning and practicing, they begin to communicate more efficiently than they did before you learned it. And this helps form what we call a memory trace, which is actually kind of like a physically laying out a memory in your brain and a way for your brain to access it. And we also know that over time, the better your neurons communicate, they form like these new neurons and new pathways and strengthening connections, and that this is called this is called neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons and new pathways. And through these two processes, we actually physically store memories as memory traces and memory pathways in our brain. Now, where are these stores happen? Like, where are these memory traces? Well, technically memories can be stored in lots of different places depending on the type of memory in your brain. But there are a few that you need to know specifically for this unit. So explicit memories, remember those memories of what they are. So semantic memories, episodic memories, what we really know about them is that they are processed through the hippocampus. So they're not really stored in the hippocampus, but the hippocampus processes them, like helps you actually deal with the information, and then sends it to the part of the brain, the cerebral cortex, the prefrontal cortex, all the other parts of the brain, if you can see over here, right? So you have the hippocampus, it's down here, and it processes these memories and then sends it to different parts of the brain in this yellow and green area. Your implicit memories, your memories for how to do things, those are controlled or kind of focused on your cerebellum, which is where procedural memories are formed down here, and your basal ganglia, which is this network of cells, area of cells right here in the center, and that is for skill development. So forming procedural memories and forming skill development, the cerebellum and the basal ganglia are both essential. Now, what's really interesting is that a lot of times students will ask me like, oh, Ms. Schaefer, how come like you can't remember anything when you were little, right? And I'm like, oh, well, that's because your hippocampus isn't actually fully developed, right? It's one of the last areas of the brain to kind of like fully develop as you're going through your like infancy and early childhood. And so what they think is that one of the reasons why we don't have really any memories until around the age of 4 is because part of that is because the hippocampus is developing during that time and is kind of fully ready to help us store those memories after the age of 4. Also, like, we don't have a lot of language when we're young, and we maybe not as focused as we should be, so it's not the only answer, but it's part of the answer, right, to why this may happen. Okay, so last little bit here on storage of memory and stress, right? How stress impacts the storage of memory. So stress can both strengthen and impair your memory, right? And if you look at the little graphic below here, anytime a little lightning bolt is below the line, it's showing a time when stress can impair your memory. Anytime it's above the line, it's when stress can strengthen a memory. So stress strengthens the memory when we are trying to encode it and store it, right? And stress activates hormones in our body. We have cortisol, brain structures get activated, pay attention, the amygdala, and this forms a lasting memory trace in our brain that makes it easier to remember the situation, the event, the details, etc. Significant stress can, of course, lead to intrusive or unforgettable memories, so having PTSD around some sort of trauma that is caused by significant stress. There is a very specific type of memory called a flashbulb memory, which is a clear memory of an emotionally significant event. And when we talk about this, we think about like 9/11 for kind of my generation was emotionally significant. I remember what I was doing that day and what happened, way more than like what happened on 9/12 or 9/13. But it could be, you know, personal. So it could be if you had a death in the family that was really significant in your life, or something positive. Like, let's say you got adopted by a family and you remember your adoption day. So it's a very clear memory of an emotionally significant event. However, like I said, stress can also impair your memory. So stress that happens in a consistent or prolonged way. So that's this little lightning bolt down here. It's the idea of like, if you're always stressed, that can actually damage your hippocampus and thereby damaging your ability to store memories. Stress can also overload your working memory. So that would be these little lightning bolts over here. And the idea is that when you are stressed, it is adding a component for your working memory to handle, because the stress is like, I can't do this is hard, I'm going to fail, right? There's lots of things happening there. And all of those thoughts block your ability to access what your memory wants to access inside your LTM, your long-term memory, right? So stress can overload your working memory, making it hard to remember, which is why people who have test anxiety often don't do as well as they want on exams. All right, that's all we have for memory storage. So before you end this video, make sure you can answer our essential questions listed below. And that's all for now, AP Psychos. And remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.